Portland, Oregon, March 15, 2019. The morning air carried an unusual chill for mid-March when Catherine Reynolds received the call that would unravel one of the most disturbing cases of her 15-year career as a Child Protective Services investigator. The automated attendance system at Lincoln Middle School had flagged a student after 3 consecutive weeks of unexplained absences. What began as a routine welfare check would soon expose a darkness hiding in plain sight within the quiet neighborhoods of Northeast Portland. Emma Carter, age 12, had simply vanished from the educational system without a trace. No parent calls, no medical excuses, no communication whatsoever. The school had attempted to contact the family multiple times, but every phone number on file led to disconnected lines or voicemail boxes that had long since stopped accepting messages. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. Catherine had seen countless cases of truancy throughout her career, but something about this particular situation triggered her professional instincts. The girl had been an exemplary student until January, maintaining perfect attendance and grades that placed her in the top 5% of her class. Students like Emma didn't simply disappear without reason. The address on file led Catherine to a deteriorating apartment complex on the eastern edge of the city, where faded paint peeled from wooden siding and chain-link fences sagged under the weight of neglect. The building manager, a weathered man in his 60s, barely remembered the Carter family. He confirmed that rent payments continued to arrive on time each month, always in cash, slipped under his office door in plain white envelopes. Unit 2B sat at the end of a dimly lit hallway on the second floor. Catherine knocked firmly, announcing her presence and agency affiliation. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost deliberate. She knocked again, louder this time, and waited. Just as she prepared to leave a notice on the door, she heard movement inside. The girl who answered bore little resemblance to the smiling child in the school photograph Catherine carried in her case file. Emma Carter stood in the doorway with shoulders squared, her expression guarded and mature beyond her years. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes, though clean, appeared worn and oversized. Catherine noticed immediately that Emma was alone. The apartment behind her sat in near darkness, curtains drawn against the afternoon light. When asked about her parents, the girl's response came measured and rehearsed, explaining that her father worked long hours and her mother had passed away 3 years prior. The story felt incomplete, carefully constructed. Catherine's training had taught her to recognize the signs of coaching, the way children learn to provide acceptable answers to keep investigators at bay. But Emma's demeanor suggested something more complex than simple truancy or parental neglect. This child carried herself with the exhausted determination of someone fighting a battle that no 12-year-old should face alone. Catherine requested permission to enter the apartment, framing it as a brief safety check. Emma hesitated, her hand tightening on the doorframe, before stepping aside with obvious reluctance. The interior revealed a space maintained with meticulous care despite its worn furnishings. Everything had its place, surfaces wiped clean, dishes stacked neatly in a drying rack by the sink. What struck Catherine most forcefully was the absence of chaos, the usual markers of a child's presence. No backpack thrown carelessly by the door, no scattered homework or electronic devices charging on counters. The apartment felt less like a home and more like a carefully managed survival station. As Catherine conducted her assessment, she observed details that deepened her concern. The refrigerator contained minimal food, mostly bulk items like rice, beans, and bargain packages of pasta. A small table in the corner held neat stacks of envelopes and papers, organized with an adult's precision. On the kitchen counter sat a calculator beside a spiral notebook filled with columns of numbers. Emma answered questions with practiced efficiency, providing information that sounded truthful, yet revealed nothing substantial. Her father, David Carter, worked in construction. He left early and returned late. Yes, there was food in the house. Yes, she felt safe. No, she didn't need anything. But Catherine had spent enough years in this field to recognize the performance. She'd learned to look beyond words to the evidence that children couldn't always hide. Emma's hands told a different story than her carefully controlled responses. Red marks and small scars covered her palms and fingers, the kind of damage that came from repeated exposure to harsh chemicals or prolonged manual labor. When Catherine asked about the marks, Emma's rehearsed composure faltered for just a moment. She explained them away as accidents from helping her father with household projects, but the explanation didn't align with the pattern of injuries. These weren't the random scrapes of an active child or the occasional kitchen burn from cooking dinner. These were the hands of someone engaged in regular, sustained physical work. Catherine's investigation protocol required her to verify the father's employment and contact information. Emma provided a phone number that, like all the others, went directly to voicemail. The construction company she named had no record of employing anyone named David Carter. Property records showed the apartment lease had been renewed 6 months ago, with payments continuing steadily despite the apparent absence of verifiable income. As Catherine prepared to leave, she spotted something that made her pause. Tucked partially under the couch sat a worn sneaker, its sole split and repaired with duct tape. Next to it lay a newspaper, open to the classified section where several delivery routes had been circled in pencil. The pieces didn't fit the picture Emma had painted of a father working construction to support his daughter. Catherine informed Emma that she would need to speak with David Carter directly, and soon. The girl's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, fear flickering across her features before she regained control. She promised that her father would contact the agency within 24 hours. But Catherine's instincts, honed through years of investigating cases where children suffered behind closed doors, told her this situation required immediate action. She made the decision to return that evening, unannounced, hoping to finally meet the father whose absence had become increasingly suspicious. That night, Catherine parked down the street from the apartment complex and waited. Hours passed as darkness settled over the neighborhood. Lights flickered on in windows around the complex, but Unit 2B remained dark. At 9:30, movement caught her attention. Emma emerged from the building, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a large canvas bag. The girl moved with purpose, checking the street before heading toward the bus stop on the corner. Catherine followed at a distance, her concern mounting with each block. Emma boarded a bus heading downtown, sitting near the back and keeping her eyes fixed straight ahead. 20 minutes later, she disembarked in an industrial area where warehouses and small businesses lined the streets. The girl walked directly to a commercial laundromat, its fluorescent lights harsh against the night. Through the windows, Catherine watched Emma enter through a back door, greeted by a woman who handed her an apron. For the next 2 hours, Emma worked steadily, loading and folding laundry, cleaning machines, and mopping floors. Catherine's mind raced through the implications. A 12-year-old child, working alone late into the night, her school attendance abandoned, her father nowhere to be found. This went beyond neglect into territory that suggested exploitation or worse. When Emma finally left the laundromat just before midnight, Catherine made the decision to approach. But before she could exit her vehicle, the girl had already boarded another bus, this one heading back toward her neighborhood. Catherine followed once more, documenting everything. Emma returned to the dark apartment and disappeared inside. Catherine waited another hour, but no other person arrived. The conclusion became inescapable. This child was living alone, working multiple jobs, maintaining a fabricated story to keep authorities away. The next morning, Catherine arrived at the apartment with a police welfare check authorization. This time, Emma couldn't maintain the pretense. Exhaustion had worn down her defenses. When Catherine pressed for the truth, the story began to emerge in fragments. David Carter had disappeared 6 months earlier, though not in the way typical missing person cases unfolded. Emma explained that her father had suffered a serious workplace accident the previous September, one that left him unable to work. Without insurance or workers' compensation, the medical bills had accumulated into an insurmountable debt. Faced with financial ruin and unable to provide for his daughter, David had made a choice that Emma described in terms that suggested she'd been coached to understand it as noble rather than abandonment. He had left to protect her, or so the story went. But the details Emma provided felt incomplete, the edges worn smooth from repetition like a stone in a river. Catherine's search of the apartment, now conducted with Emma's reluctant cooperation, revealed the extent of the child's desperate circumstances. The stacks of papers on the table weren't schoolwork, but payment receipts, work schedules, and meticulously tracked expenses. The notebook filled with numbers documented every dollar earned and spent, a budget maintained with the precision of an experienced accountant. Hidden under Emma's mattress, Catherine discovered another notebook, this one different from the financial records. Its pages contained addresses scattered throughout Portland and the surrounding areas, some crossed out, others circled. Next to many addresses were notations, times, dates, and small symbols whose meaning wasn't immediately clear. Emma's reaction to this discovery revealed the first genuine fear Catherine had witnessed. The girl lunged forward, trying to retrieve the notebook, her composure finally shattering completely. In that moment of raw panic, Catherine understood that this case extended far beyond a missing father and a child trying to survive alone. The addresses in that notebook represented something darker, a network or system that Emma had become entangled in during her father's absence. Whatever had happened to David Carter, whatever circumstances had led to his disappearance, had left his daughter vulnerable to something that frightened her more than authorities, more than foster care, more than anything Catherine could threaten her with. As Catherine documented the evidence and prepared to take Emma into protective custody, the girl finally spoke words that would haunt the investigator for weeks to come. She mentioned a man, someone she had to pay every week, someone who knew where her father was hiding. The payments Emma made weren't just to cover rent and survival. They were tribute, insurance, protection money paid by a 12-year-old child to keep her father safe from an unnamed threat. The case that Catherine had assumed would be a straightforward intervention into a truancy situation had transformed into something far more sinister. Somewhere in Portland, David Carter was hiding or being hidden. His daughter had been working herself to exhaustion, missing school, sacrificing her childhood, all to pay an unknown person for reasons that Emma either couldn't or wouldn't fully explain. As Catherine drove Emma to the emergency youth shelter that would serve as her temporary placement, she reviewed the evidence she'd collected. The notebook with addresses, the work schedules from multiple locations, the injuries on the girl's hands, the late-night shifts, and most troubling of all, the regular cash payments to an unnamed man. The investigation had only just begun, but already Catherine could sense the scope of what lay hidden beneath the surface. This wasn't a simple case of a struggling family fallen on hard times. Something organized, something deliberate, had ensnared Emma Carter, and possibly dozens of others like her. That night, Catherine began the process of cross-referencing the addresses in Emma's notebook with city records, business registrations, and other cases in the Child Protective Services database. What she discovered in those initial searches would confirm her darkest suspicions and open an investigation that would eventually require federal involvement. But those revelations would come later. For now, as Emma sat in the shelter clutching the few possessions Catherine had allowed her to bring, including a worn photograph of her father, the full truth remained locked away in the shadows of Portland's hidden economy. The question that would drive the investigation forward had crystallized in Catherine's mind. What kind of operation could convince a 12-year-old child that her only option was to sacrifice everything to protect her father from an unnamed threat? The answer, when it finally emerged, would prove more disturbing than anyone involved in the case could have imagined. Portland, Oregon, March 18, 2019. 3 days after Emma Carter entered protective custody, Catherine Reynolds sat in her office surrounded by evidence that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The notebook discovered under Emma's mattress had become the focal point of an investigation that was expanding far beyond a single missing father and his daughter. Each address listed in those pages told a story. Catherine had spent 72 hours systematically visiting every location, documenting what she found, and slowly piecing together the impossible schedule that Emma had maintained for the past 6 months. The revelation of how this child had survived alone challenged everything Catherine thought she understood about the limits of human endurance. The first address led to a commercial laundromat on Southeast Division Street, the same location where Catherine had observed Emma working late into the night. The owner, a woman named Margaret Chen, initially denied employing anyone under 18. Only when confronted with photographic evidence did she admit that Emma had worked there 3 nights per week, from 9 at night until midnight, paid in cash at below minimum wage. Margaret's defensive explanation revealed the rationale that had allowed this arrangement to continue unchecked. The girl had needed work, had presented herself as mature and reliable, and had never caused problems or drawn attention. The owner had convinced herself that providing employment, even illegally, was somehow helping rather than exploiting a desperate child. The second address belonged to a newspaper distribution center near the industrial waterfront. Here, Emma had worked the morning delivery route, arriving at 4:30 each morning to sort and bundle papers before completing a route that covered 12 square blocks. The shift ended at 7, theoretically giving her time to attend school, though Catherine now understood why Emma had stopped going to classes. The physical exhaustion alone would have made education impossible. The distribution manager, a man named Robert Fletcher, showed even less remorse than the laundromat owner. He characterized Emma as one of his most dependable contractors, never late, never complaining, always completing her route efficiently. The fact that she was 12 years old seemed irrelevant to him. In his view, he had provided an opportunity, and Emma had proven herself worthy of it. Catherine documented each interview with growing anger, but she maintained professional composure. These employers, while clearly guilty of labor law violations, were pieces of a larger puzzle. The question that consumed her thoughts was simpler and more disturbing. How had Emma found these jobs, and who had taught her to navigate this underground economy with such precision? The third address revealed the most physically demanding of Emma's employment arrangements. A small auto repair shop in North Portland had hired her as a general assistant, cleaning tools, organizing parts, and performing basic maintenance tasks. The work exposed her to harsh chemicals and industrial equipment, explaining the burns and scars Catherine had observed on the girl's hands. The shop owner, a man who identified himself only as Marcus, proved more difficult to interview. He became immediately defensive, threatening to call his lawyer and refusing to provide his full name or documentation. Catherine noted his reactions carefully, sensing that this location held significance beyond illegal child labor. Something about Marcus's aggressive response and the shop's isolated location suggested deeper involvement in whatever network had ensnared Emma. The fourth and fifth addresses presented a pattern that Catherine found particularly troubling. Both were private residences in affluent neighborhoods of southwest Portland, addresses where Emma had worked as a house cleaner, arriving on scheduled days to perform deep cleaning services while the owners were at work. These arrangements spoke to a level of organization and networking that a 12-year-old child couldn't have established independently. One homeowner, Jessica Morrison, expressed shock when Catherine explained that the cleaning service she'd hired had sent a middle school-aged child to her house. She had paid a management fee to a company called Premier Home Solutions, assuming they employed and vetted adult workers. The revelation that a child had been cleaning her home, often for 6-hour shifts, left her visibly shaken. Premier Home Solutions, Catherine quickly discovered, existed only as a forwarding number and a post office box. The business had no physical location, no registered employees, and no verifiable licensing. It served as a front, a mechanism for funneling vulnerable workers into private homes while maintaining plausible deniability for the actual operators. The final work location listed in Emma's notebook brought the investigation into even darker territory. A small restaurant in southeast Portland, operating with minimal staff and serving primarily late-night customers, had employed Emma in the kitchen. She washed dishes, prepared basic ingredients, and cleaned equipment for 4 hours each evening, 5 days per week. The restaurant owner, David Park, admitted to the arrangement without hesitation. He explained that Emma had been referred to him by someone he knew only as Tom, a man who occasionally connected small businesses with workers willing to accept cash payment and irregular hours. Park had never questioned Emma's age or circumstances, choosing to believe her claim that she was 16 and needed evening work to help her family. This revelation marked a turning point in Catherine's investigation. The name Tom appeared in Emma's notebook multiple times, always in connection with the various work addresses. This wasn't a desperate child randomly seeking employment. Someone had systematically placed Emma in multiple jobs, coordinated her schedule, and presumably collected a portion of her earnings. Catherine contacted Detective Brian Foster, a specialist in organized crime and exploitation cases with the Portland Police Bureau. Brian had spent a decade investigating human trafficking, labor exploitation, and underground economic networks. When Catherine presented her findings, his experience immediately recognized patterns that she had suspected but couldn't yet prove. Brian's analysis revealed disturbing parallels to cases he'd investigated involving immigrant workers, undocumented individuals, and other vulnerable populations caught in systems of controlled exploitation. The model was consistent: identify desperate people with few options, offer solutions to immediate problems, then create dependency through debt, fear, or both. Together, they began a comprehensive review of Emma's financial records, the meticulous notebook where she tracked every dollar earned and spent. The numbers told a story of survival calculated down to the penny. Emma's total monthly income from all 5 jobs averaged approximately $2,000, an amount earned through what Catherine calculated to be between 60 and 70 hours of work per week. Her expenses accounted for roughly $1,500 monthly: rent, utilities, food, and basic necessities. But the remaining $500 disappeared each month in a single transaction, recorded in Emma's neat handwriting as simply payment with a date and time notation. These payments occurred every Friday evening at 7 o'clock at various locations throughout the city. The meeting spots changed each week, but the pattern remained consistent. Emma would leave her apartment carrying an envelope, meet with someone at a predetermined location, hand over the cash, and return home. The notebook contained a record of every transaction stretching back 6 months, documenting nearly $12,000 paid to an unknown recipient. Brian immediately requested surveillance footage from businesses near the payment locations. Working through the records, he identified several instances where security cameras had captured Emma's transactions. The footage showed the same sequence each time: Emma arriving alone, waiting near a parked vehicle, approaching when the driver emerged, handing over an envelope, and walking away. The man receiving the payments appeared to be in his 40s, average height and build, with no distinguishing features visible in the grainy security footage. He drove different vehicles each time, suggesting either access to multiple cars or deliberate efforts to avoid establishing a pattern that could be traced. Brian ran the visible license plates through law enforcement databases, discovering that 3 of the vehicles had been reported stolen within the previous year. The 4th belonged to a rental agency that had rented it to a customer using identification that proved to be fraudulent. Every lead circled back to dead ends and false identities. The investigation took on new urgency when Catherine arranged to interview Emma at the youth shelter. The girl had spent 3 days in protective custody, initially refusing to speak beyond providing basic information for her case file. But Catherine's gentle persistence and genuine concern had begun to crack through Emma's defensive walls. During their 4th conversation, Emma finally revealed crucial information about the man she called Tom. She explained that he had approached her father shortly before David's disappearance, offering a solution to their overwhelming medical debt. The accident that had injured David, preventing him from working construction, had also left them with hospital bills exceeding $200,000. Without insurance or the means to pay, David had faced collection actions, lawsuits, and the threat of having his wages garnished indefinitely. Tom had presented an alternative arrangement. The debt could be managed, even eliminated, if David was willing to work off the amount through a special program that helped people in impossible financial situations. The program, as Emma understood it from what her father had told her, involved working in locations where traditional labor markets didn't reach, accepting assignments that paid well but required discretion and willingness to ask no questions. David had initially believed this meant manual labor jobs, under-the-table construction work, or similar arrangements. But the reality had proven far more complicated and dangerous. Emma didn't fully understand what her father had discovered about Tom's operation, but she knew it had frightened him badly enough that he felt his only option was to disappear. Before leaving, David had made Emma promise to maintain contact with Tom, to make regular payments that would keep the debt from transferring to her or forcing David out of hiding. The story confirmed Brian's suspicions about organized exploitation. Tom represented a system that identified vulnerable people drowning in medical debt, legal problems, or desperate circumstances, then offered solutions that trapped them in cycles of controlled labor and perpetual obligation. The genius of the system lay in its exploitation of fear. Victims believed they had no legal recourse because they'd entered the arrangement voluntarily, making them unlikely to seek help from authorities. Brian obtained a warrant to access David Carter's medical records and financial history. The documents revealed the crushing weight that had driven a father to desperate measures. The accident had occurred at a construction site where David worked for a small contractor with minimal insurance coverage. The injury required surgery, extensive physical therapy, and months of recovery. The hospital had billed David directly for services not covered by the contractor's limited policy. Collection agencies had begun aggressive pursuit within weeks. Court judgments had been filed. David's bank account had been frozen. The machinery of medical debt collection had ground forward with mechanical efficiency, destroying a working-class family's financial stability in the space of months. Among David's records, Brian found correspondence from a debt relief organization called Fresh Start Financial Solutions. The company's literature promised to negotiate medical debt, prevent wage garnishment, and provide manageable payment plans for people facing impossible situations. A handwritten note in David's file indicated he had contacted them in late August, just weeks before his disappearance. Fresh Start Financial Solutions maintained a professional website and a business address in downtown Portland. Brian visited the office, discovering a small suite in a larger building occupied by various service businesses. A receptionist explained that Fresh Start primarily operated remotely, meeting with clients by appointment. When Brian requested information about their debt management programs, she provided brochures that described legitimate-sounding services. But Brian's trained eye caught discrepancies in the materials. The contact information used non-standard phone numbers. The business registration, when he checked city and state records, showed incorporation only 9 months earlier. Most tellingly, the listed principals of the company were names that appeared in databases of known aliases associated with fraud and exploitation cases. Fresh Start Financial Solutions served as a front, a respectable facade for recruiting victims into Tom's network. People drowning in medical debt, facing foreclosure, or desperate to avoid bankruptcy would contact the company seeking help. After providing detailed financial information and documentation of their circumstances, they would be evaluated for special programs available to those in the most dire situations. Those who qualified, meaning those sufficiently desperate and isolated, would be contacted by representatives who offered arrangements that existed outside traditional financial systems. The promises sounded reasonable at first: work opportunities that paid enough to manage the debt, flexible schedules, and relief from aggressive collection actions. Only after agreeing did victims discover the true nature of the arrangement. They became part of an underground labor network, dispatched to jobs that exploited their desperation, paid below legal wages, and extracted fees that ensured the debt never actually decreased. Those who resisted or threatened to report the operation faced blackmail, threats against family members, or fabricated evidence of crimes they'd never committed. Brian recognized this as a sophisticated evolution of traditional labor trafficking. Rather than forcibly controlling victims, the operation used legal and financial systems to create voluntary servitude. People entered the arrangement believing they had chosen it, making them less likely to seek help and more vulnerable to manipulation. The investigation team expanded to include federal agents from the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. Special Agent Rachel Morrison reviewed the evidence and confirmed that the patterns matched operations her team had been tracking across multiple western states. This wasn't an isolated Portland crime, but part of a regional network that had been operating for at least 3 years. Rachel explained that medical debt had become a primary recruitment tool for modern exploitation operations. Unlike traditional trafficking that relied on kidnapping or deception, these networks found victims who were already trapped by legitimate debt and desperate circumstances. The operation provided solutions that were technically voluntary but practically enslaved people through fear and financial manipulation. The team developed a strategy to identify Tom and dismantle his network. They would use Emma's scheduled payments as an opportunity to establish surveillance and eventually make an arrest. But first, they needed Emma's cooperation, something Catherine warned would be difficult to obtain. The girl's primary concern remained protecting her father. Despite months of exploitation, despite being forced into grueling work and isolation, Emma's loyalty to David never wavered. She believed that continuing to make payments kept him safe, and any disruption of that arrangement threatened to expose him to danger she couldn't fully articulate. Catherine spent hours talking with Emma, building trust, and explaining that the only way to truly protect her father was to help authorities dismantle the system that held them both captive. She showed Emma evidence of other victims, families destroyed by operations like Tom's network, and the reality that the debt would never actually be paid off through this arrangement. Slowly, Emma began to understand that her sacrifice had been manipulated, that Tom had never intended to free either her or her father from their obligation. The system was designed to extract labor indefinitely, using the fiction of debt repayment to maintain control while actually ensuring the debt could never decrease to zero. On March 25th, Emma agreed to cooperate with the investigation. She would make her scheduled Friday payment while police established surveillance at the meeting location. Undercover officers would document the transaction and follow Tom after the exchange, tracking him to wherever he went next. The goal was to identify his base of operations and gather evidence of the broader network before making arrests. The operation was scheduled for Friday, March 29th, at a parking lot near the Lloyd Center shopping district. As the date approached, the investigation team prepared for every contingency. They knew from experience that operations like Tom's often had layers of protection, lookouts, and security measures designed to detect law enforcement presence. But they also knew that Emma represented their best chance to infiltrate a network that had successfully hidden in plain sight for years. Through this one 12-year-old girl's terrible ordeal, they had found a window into a system that turned desperation into profit and transformed ordinary people into invisible laborers trapped by debts they could never escape. What none of them fully anticipated was how deeply the network's roots had grown into Portland's economy, or how many lives had been caught in its machinery. The case that had begun with a truant student's missing school attendance was about to expose an operation that had ensnared dozens of families and generated millions of dollars through the systematic exploitation of medical debt and fear. As Friday approached, Catherine found herself thinking about the strength required for a 12-year-old child to survive 6 months alone, working impossible hours, never asking for help, all to protect her father from threats she barely understood. That strength would now be tested in a different way as Emma prepared to face the man who had stolen her childhood and trapped her family in a nightmare disguised as a solution. The investigation was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and everyone involved understood that Tom, whoever he truly was, would not surrender his operation without a fight. Portland, Oregon, March 29th, 2019. The parking lot near Lloyd Center sat in the gray zone between commercial districts and residential neighborhoods, a space unremarkable enough to avoid attention, yet public enough to provide the illusion of safety. Detective Brian Foster had selected surveillance positions days in advance, identifying sightlines and establishing protocols for the operation that would unfold that Friday evening. 7 unmarked vehicles occupied strategic positions around the meeting location, each containing officers equipped with cameras, communications equipment, and instructions to maintain distance until Tom departed with Emma's payment. The goal remained observation rather than immediate arrest. Following Tom could reveal the network's infrastructure and identify other victims trapped in the same system that had ensnared the Carter family. Catherine Reynolds sat in one of the surveillance vehicles, her stomach tight with anxiety despite years of experience in difficult cases. Emma had agreed to cooperate, but the girl's fear remained palpable. The 12-year-old understood intellectually that police protection surrounded her, yet 6 months of conditioning had taught her that defying Tom's instructions carried consequences she couldn't fully articulate. At precisely 7 o'clock, Emma arrived at the designated location on foot, carrying the familiar white envelope containing $500 in cash. The money had been provided by the police department, marked bills that could be traced if recovered later as evidence. Emma moved with the mechanical precision of someone performing a routine that had become numbingly familiar. The surveillance team watched as a sedan entered the parking lot from the opposite end, moving slowly, the driver scanning the area before pulling into a space 30 feet from where Emma waited. The vehicle matched descriptions from previous exchanges, though the license plates were different, suggesting rotation through multiple stolen or fraudulently registered cars. Tom emerged from the vehicle exactly as security footage had shown in previous transactions. Average height, wearing nondescript clothing that made him forgettable, moving with casual confidence that suggested he had no reason to fear observation. He approached Emma, accepted the envelope without counting its contents, and returned to his car within 90 seconds. The exchange appeared routine, practiced, unremarkable to anyone who might have witnessed it. Tom started his engine and exited the parking lot, turning south toward the industrial district. 4 surveillance vehicles began following at carefully calculated distances, maintaining visual contact while avoiding patterns that might alert their target to law enforcement presence. Brian coordinated the pursuit through encrypted radio communications, directing units to alternate positions and ensuring that no single vehicle remained in Tom's rearview mirror for too long. The suspect drove without urgency, obeying traffic signals and speed limits, his movement suggesting either ignorance of the surveillance or confidence that his operation remained invisible to authorities. The pursuit continued for 40 minutes, winding through southeast Portland's warehouse district, before Tom turned onto a side street lined with industrial buildings and storage facilities. He pulled into the parking area of a nondescript 2-story structure with minimal signage, a building that property records identified as registered to a limited liability company, with an address that traced back to a mail forwarding service. Tom entered the building through a side door, disappearing from view. The surveillance team established a perimeter and waited, documenting who entered and exited while Brian worked to obtain a warrant for the building's search. The urgency had increased significantly. They had identified what appeared to be Tom's base of operations, but without proper authorization, any evidence discovered could be ruled inadmissible in court. While Brian coordinated with prosecutors to expedite the warrant process, other members of the investigation team began researching the building's history and current occupants. The limited liability company that owned the property, registered as Cascade Business Solutions, had been created 18 months earlier. Its listed purpose included consulting services, human resources management, and business development, descriptions vague enough to cover almost any activity. Financial records showed that Cascade Business Solutions maintained accounts with 3 different banks, processing hundreds of thousands of dollars in transactions each month. The money moved through a complex web of transfers, deposits, and withdrawals that suggested deliberate efforts to obscure its origins and destinations. Forensic accountants would need months to trace all the connections, but the volume alone indicated an operation far larger than the exploitation of a single family. Cross-referencing addresses associated with Cascade Business Solutions revealed connections to Fresh Start Financial Solutions, the debt relief organization that had initially recruited David Carter. Both entities shared administrative contacts, banking relationships, and registration information that confirmed they were part of the same criminal enterprise. As investigators dug deeper into the corporate structures, they discovered more connected businesses, employment agencies that specialized in placing temporary workers, property management companies that operated low-income housing, and even a medical billing service that handled accounts for several hospitals and clinics. The network had embedded itself into multiple sectors of Portland's economy, creating a self-reinforcing system that identified vulnerable people, trapped them in debt, and extracted their labor while maintaining a facade of legitimate business operations. Federal agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division joined the investigation, bringing expertise in tracking money laundering and corporate fraud. Their analysis revealed that the network extended beyond Oregon into Washington, California, and Nevada. Hundreds of workers, possibly thousands, had been funneled through the system over the past 3 years, each one trapped by debts they couldn't escape and threatened with consequences they couldn't risk. The warrant arrived at 11 o'clock that night, authorizing the search of the building where Tom had entered hours earlier. The surveillance team reported that he remained inside along with at least 3 other individuals who had arrived separately throughout the evening. Lights burned in second-floor windows, suggesting active operations despite the late hour. Brian assembled a tactical entry team, briefing officers on the building's layout and potential risks. They knew from experience that operations involving exploitation and trafficking sometimes employed armed security or maintained evidence destruction protocols. The entry needed to be swift and coordinated to prevent the destruction of records or escape of suspects. At 11:30, the tactical team breached the building's entrances simultaneously, announcing police presence and ordering occupants to show their hands. Officers flooded into the structure, securing rooms and detaining individuals found inside. Tom attempted to flee through a back exit, but was intercepted by officers positioned there in anticipation of such an attempt. The building's interior revealed the scope of the operation that had remained hidden from public view. The first floor contained a reception area designed to appear professional, with furniture, computers, and filing cabinets that could belong to any small business office. Brochures for Fresh Start. Financial solutions sat in holders on a waiting room table, alongside pamphlets for employment services and debt counseling. But the second floor told a different story. Here, investigators found the operational center of the network, banks of computers running database software that tracked hundreds of individual cases, filing cabinets filled with personal information, financial records, work schedules, and payment histories. Whiteboards on the walls displayed charts showing worker placements, cash flow projections, and territory maps dividing the Portland metropolitan area into managed zones. One room contained surveillance equipment and files of photographs showing workers at various job sites, images that appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge or consent. These surveillance records served multiple purposes, ensuring workers maintained their schedules, identifying potential problems, and gathering material that could be used for blackmail or intimidation if anyone threatened to expose the operation. Most disturbing were the files detailing the recruitment and management process. Each victim had a folder containing their complete financial history, documentation of their debts, copies of medical bills or legal judgments, and assessment notes evaluating their vulnerability. The files read like hunting records, with annotations describing which pressures worked most effectively on different personality types and family situations. Emma Carter's file sat among dozens of others in a cabinet marked with the current year. Her folder documented everything Tom had learned about her family: David's accident and resulting medical debt, his inability to work, Emma's age and school records, and assessments of how best to exploit their desperation. Notes indicated that Emma had been deemed ideal for labor placement due to her maturity, work ethic, and devotion to her father, qualities that made her unlikely to seek help or resist exploitation. The file also contained information that explained David Carter's disappearance and the true nature of the threat that had kept Emma making payments for 6 months. Tom's operation had manufactured evidence suggesting David had committed fraud related to insurance claims following his accident. Forged documents showed David filing false injury reports, inflating medical expenses, and attempting to defraud the construction company's insurance provider. This fabricated evidence served as leverage, ensuring David's cooperation and silence. If he went to authorities about the exploitation, Tom could turn over the forged documents to prosecutors, resulting in criminal charges against David that could lead to imprisonment. The threat was sophisticated, legally complex, and devastating in its effectiveness. A desperate man trying to protect his daughter from a system he didn't understand had become trapped by evidence of crimes he'd never committed. The investigators also found records indicating David's current location. Tom had arranged for him to work at a construction site in Eugene, Oregon, approximately 2 hours south of Portland. The job provided minimal payment, barely enough for David to survive in a shared trailer with other workers trapped in similar situations. The arrangement kept him away from his daughter, isolated from anyone who might help, and constantly reminded that any attempt to escape would result in both his arrest and Emma's placement in foster care. As officers processed the evidence and transported Tom and his associates to jail for booking, Brian contacted authorities in Eugene to locate and secure David Carter's safety. Within hours, police in Eugene had found David at the construction site, bringing him into protective custody and beginning the process of explaining that the threat that had controlled his life for 6 months had been manufactured by criminals who would now face prosecution. The scope of the network became clearer as investigators worked through the night examining seized records. Cascade Business Solutions and its connected entities had exploited at least 140 families over the past 3 years, generating an estimated $4 million in profits through the systematic extraction of labor from desperate people trapped by debt. The victims came from diverse backgrounds, united only by their vulnerability. Medical debt was the most common entry point, but the network also targeted people facing eviction, legal problems, or immigration issues. In each case, the operation identified someone desperate enough to accept help from any source, then transformed that desperation into a prison constructed from fear, obligation, and manufactured evidence. Fresh start. Financial Solutions had processed more than 500 inquiries in the past year alone, evaluating each person who contacted them for potential recruitment into the labor network. Those deemed insufficiently desperate or too well connected to risk exploiting received legitimate debt counseling referrals. Those who met the profile for victimization received offers that seemed too good to refuse, solutions to impossible problems that came with hidden costs far exceeding any benefit. The investigation also revealed connections to corrupted officials within the medical billing industry. 3 administrators at different hospitals had accepted payments to inflate certain patients' bills, target people without insurance, and delay negotiation processes that might have resolved debts through legitimate means. These corrupted insiders identified vulnerable patients and referred their information to Fresh Start Financial Solutions, completing the pipeline that fed victims into Tom's exploitation network. As dawn broke over Portland on March 30th, investigators had arrested 7 individuals directly involved in operating the network. Tom, whose real name proved to be Thomas Weber, a man with a criminal history spanning 2 decades and involving fraud, extortion, and labor violations across multiple states. The complexity and reach of his current operation represented a disturbing evolution from his previous crimes. Weber had learned from past mistakes, creating a structure that appeared legitimate on its surface while hiding exploitation beneath layers of corporate entities, forged documents, and carefully maintained fear. He had identified a vulnerability in American society, the crushing weight of medical debt and the desperation it created, and built a business model around systematically trapping people in modern servitude. Catherine received the call about David Carter's recovery at 6 in the morning. She immediately contacted the youth shelter where Emma had spent the past 2 weeks in protective custody, arranging for the girl to be brought to the police station where father and daughter could finally reunite after 6 months of separation and sacrifice. The reunion would be emotional and complex, marked by trauma that would require years to process and heal. But for the first time since David's accident had destroyed their financial stability and made them vulnerable to predators like Thomas Weber, the Carter family could begin to imagine a future free from the weight of manufactured debt and false threats. As investigators continued processing evidence from the raid, they began contacting other victims identified in Weber's records. Each notification started a similar process, explaining that the debts they'd been working to repay through the network were either fraudulent or had been maintained through illegal means, informing them that they were victims rather than criminals, and beginning the complex task of helping them rebuild lives that had been stolen. The case that had started with a 12-year-old girl's unexplained absence from school had exposed a criminal enterprise that transformed human desperation into profit. The investigation would continue for months, unraveling financial trails, identifying additional victims, and building cases against everyone who had participated in the network's operations. But the immediate crisis had ended. Thomas Weber sat in custody, facing charges that would likely result in decades of imprisonment. His network had been dismantled, his records seized, his ability to harm others destroyed. And somewhere in a police station in Portland, a father and daughter were reunited, beginning the long process of recovering from an ordeal that should never have been possible in a country with laws designed to prevent exactly this kind of exploitation. The investigation had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Systems meant to help people trapped by medical debt had become hunting grounds for predators who understood that desperation creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates opportunity. Thomas Weber's operation had thrived not despite social safety nets, but because those nets had holes large enough for entire families to fall through. As Catherine prepared the reports that would document the case for prosecutors and policymakers, she found herself considering the broader implications. How many other operations like Weber's existed, hiding in plain sight, transforming legitimate debts into tools of exploitation? The question would haunt her long after this particular case closed, a reminder that the work of protecting vulnerable people was never truly finished. For now, though, there was Emma Carter, a child who had sacrificed everything to protect her father, and who could finally return to being what she should have been all along, a 12-year-old girl with a chance to heal, grow, and eventually build a life free from the shadows that had consumed her childhood. The investigation was far from over, but its darkest chapter had closed. What remained was the painstaking work of justice, the gathering of evidence, the preparation of cases, and the pursuit of accountability for everyone who had participated in turning desperation into profit and transforming ordinary people into invisible laborers trapped in a nightmare disguised as salvation. Portland, Oregon, April 2, 2019. The interrogation room at the Portland Police Bureau remained silent except for the hum of recording equipment and the occasional shift of Thomas Weber's weight against the metal chair. 3 days had passed since his arrest. 3 days during which he had maintained complete silence despite the mounting evidence and the growing list of charges filed against him. Detective Brian Foster sat across from Weber, reviewing the files that documented a criminal career spanning 2 decades. Thomas Weber, age 43, had begun with small-scale fraud in his 20s, graduated to identity theft operations in his 30s, and eventually evolved into the sophisticated exploitation network that had finally brought his activities to law enforcement attention. His criminal history showed a pattern of learning from mistakes, adapting methods, and finding new vulnerabilities to exploit. The evidence seized from Weber's headquarters painted a comprehensive picture of his operation's scope and methodology. Financial records traced money flows through dozens of accounts, showing how cash extracted from victims moved through layers of transfers before being converted into legitimate-appearing assets. Property records revealed that Weber owned buildings throughout Portland and surrounding areas, real estate purchased through shell companies and used to house workers trapped in his system. Most revealing were the communications records recovered from encrypted messaging applications on computers seized during the raid. These messages showed Weber coordinating with associates across multiple states, discussing strategy for identifying vulnerable populations, sharing techniques for maintaining control over victims, and calculating profits with the cold efficiency of someone running a business rather than destroying lives. The messages also revealed something that transformed the investigation's trajectory and elevated federal interest to the highest levels. Thomas Weber wasn't the network's ultimate architect or primary beneficiary. He served as a regional manager, operating the Portland territory within a larger organization that extended across the western United States and potentially beyond. References in the communications to someone called the coordinator appeared frequently, always in context that suggested this individual held authority over Weber and directed the network's strategic expansion. The coordinator made decisions about territory assignments, approved major operational changes, and received the largest percentage of profits generated through victim exploitation. FBI Special Agent Rachel Morrison recognized the implications immediately. What had appeared to be a significant regional case had actually uncovered one branch of a national criminal enterprise. The exploitation of medical debt, the systematic targeting of vulnerable families, the sophisticated use of manufactured evidence and fear, all of it followed templates that suggested centralized planning and coordination. Rachel's team had been tracking similar operations in California, Washington, and Nevada for the past 18 months, investigating cases that shared disturbing similarities with Weber's Portland network. Each operation used the same basic model: identify people trapped by medical debt, offer solutions through front organizations, trap them in cycles of labor exploitation, and maintain control through manufactured threats and falsified evidence. The connections between these cases had remained unclear until the seizure of Weber's communications records. Now, investigators could see that what they had been treating as separate regional crimes were actually franchises within a coordinated network. The coordinator had built a criminal empire by identifying a vulnerability in American society and systematically exploiting it across multiple states. Weber's associates arrested during the raid had begun cooperating with investigators, hoping to reduce their own charges by providing information about the network's operations. Their statements revealed details about recruitment processes, victim management techniques, and the financial structures that allowed the organization to generate millions of dollars while maintaining a facade of legitimate business activity. One associate, a man named Christopher Hayes, who had managed the employment placement division, explained how the network identified and cultivated relationships with businesses willing to employ workers provided through their services. Small businesses struggling with labor costs, particularly in industries like food service, cleaning, and light manufacturing, proved receptive to offers of reliable workers willing to accept below-market wages and irregular schedules. The businesses received workers who showed up on time, worked hard, and never complained or caused problems. In return, they asked no questions about documentation, paid in cash, and maintained discretion about their labor sources. Most business owners convinced themselves they were helping people who needed work, preferring not to examine too closely why workers accepted such unfavorable conditions. Christopher described the psychology that made the system function. Business owners wanted to believe they were providing opportunities rather than participating in exploitation. Workers believed they had no choice but to accept whatever terms were offered, because the alternative was default on debts that would destroy their families. Everyone involved maintained willful ignorance about the true nature of the arrangement, allowing the network to operate with minimal risk of exposure. Another associate, Jennifer Martinez, had managed the documentation and evidence fabrication division. Her detailed statements to investigators revealed the sophisticated process of creating false evidence used to control victims. The operation employed people with expertise in document forgery, financial fraud, and legal systems, individuals who understood how to manufacture evidence convincing enough to terrify victims, but not so obvious that it would collapse under professional scrutiny if ever examined by authorities. Jennifer explained that the goal wasn't to create evidence that would hold up in court, but rather to create enough plausible threat to prevent victims from ever taking their cases to court. The fabricated documents served as psychological weapons, tools of intimidation that kept people trapped through fear of consequences they couldn't risk testing. The process of creating these false threats required research into each victim's specific situation, understanding their vulnerabilities and fears, then crafting scenarios that aligned with those vulnerabilities. For David Carter, the manufactured insurance fraud charges targeted his fear of imprisonment and separation from his daughter. For others, the threats involved immigration consequences, child custody battles, or professional licensing issues, each one calibrated to exploit whatever mattered most to the specific victim. As investigators processed information from cooperating associates, they began identifying victims beyond those found in Weber's immediate records. The network had been operating for at least 3 years, possibly longer, and during that time had processed hundreds of people through various stages of exploitation. Some had worked briefly before escaping or being released when they no longer proved profitable. Others remained trapped, still making payments and believing they had no alternative. The victim notification process became a massive undertaking. Each person identified in the seized records required contact, explanation, and assistance. Many initially refused to believe that the debts they'd been working to repay were fraudulent or that the threats they feared were manufactured. Years of psychological conditioning made them suspicious of authorities and convinced that any deviation from their payment schedules would result in the consequences they'd been promised. Catherine Reynolds coordinated the victim services response, working with social workers, legal advocates, and mental health professionals to develop protocols for helping people transition from exploitation to freedom. The process proved far more complex than simply informing people they were no longer obligated to continue working or making payments. Victims needed legal assistance to address their actual debts, mental health support to process trauma, and practical help rebuilding lives that had been disrupted by months or years of exploitation. The Carter family's case provided a template for the support services other victims would need. David Carter required medical care for injuries that had never been properly treated, legal representation to clear his name of the false charges that had been manufactured, and employment assistance to find work appropriate to his physical limitations. Emma needed trauma counseling, educational support to compensate for 6 months of missed schooling, and time to simply be a child again after functioning as an adult under impossible circumstances. As the investigation expanded to include cases in other states, a clearer picture emerged of the coordinator's organization and methods. The network operated through a franchise-like structure, with regional managers like Thomas Weber running semi-independent operations while following standardized procedures and paying percentages of profits to the central organization. The coordinator provided regional managers with training, resources, and infrastructure, including access to document forgers, corrupted officials in various industries, and sophisticated financial systems for moving and laundering money. In return, the central organization received a substantial cut of all profits while maintaining plausible distance from direct involvement in any specific cases. This structure provided the coordinator with protection from prosecution. Even if regional operations like Weber's were discovered and shut down, the central organization could continue operating through other franchises. Regional managers who were arrested had limited information about the broader network and couldn't provide evidence that would expose the coordinator's identity or location. Federal investigators recognized this structure as similar to models used by sophisticated drug trafficking organizations and international criminal enterprises. The coordinator had applied lessons from successful criminal operations to create a network that exploited systemic vulnerabilities in American healthcare, debt collection, and labor markets. The challenge now became identifying the coordinator and dismantling the central organization before it could adapt to the loss of its Portland franchise. Rachel Morrison's team knew from experience that criminal networks responded to law enforcement pressure by evolving their methods, finding new territories, and developing countermeasures against the tactics that had exposed their previous operations. Analysis of Weber's communications provided crucial leads. The coordinator used sophisticated encryption and rarely communicated directly, preferring to send instructions through intermediaries and maintaining operational security protocols that revealed professional training in intelligence or security work. But even the most careful criminals made mistakes, left traces that skilled investigators could follow. One pattern in the communications caught the attention of forensic analysts. Messages from the coordinator sometimes contained references to locations or situations that suggested the sender's geographic location or personal circumstances. These references were subtle, embedded in casual conversation rather than explicit statements, but they provided data points that investigators could use to narrow their search. Cross-referencing these subtle location indicators with the timing of messages, investigators developed a theory that the coordinator operated from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, possibly Seattle or the surrounding region. The messages showed familiarity with local geography, references to weather patterns, and mentions of events that suggested someone living in or frequently visiting the area. Federal agents in Seattle began investigating individuals with criminal backgrounds that matched the coordinator's demonstrated skills and knowledge. They looked for people with experience in financial fraud, organizational management, and the kind of sophisticated understanding of legal systems that the network's operations required. Meanwhile, forensic accountants worked to trace the financial flows that connected Weber's operation to the central organization. Following money through the layers of transfers and shell companies proved extraordinarily difficult, but gradually patterns emerged. Certain accounts served as collection points for profits from multiple regional operations. These accounts, registered to companies with no apparent legitimate business purpose, moved millions of dollars through financial systems while maintaining enough plausible documentation to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection. The accounts traced back to a financial services company registered in Delaware, a state favored by criminals for its corporate privacy laws and minimal disclosure requirements. The Delaware company had been created 4 years earlier, suggesting the network had been operating longer than investigators initially believed. Its registration information listed a management company as its principal, and that management company traced to another entity, and that one to another, each layer designed to obscure the trail and protect whoever ultimately controlled the operation. Breaking through these corporate shells required subpoenas, international cooperation, and the kind of meticulous financial investigation that took months rather than weeks. But the stakes justified the effort. The coordinator's network had generated tens of millions of dollars over its operational lifetime, exploiting thousands of victims and corrupting numerous individuals and businesses in the process. As April progressed, the investigation's scope continued expanding. More victims came forward, having heard news reports about the Portland case and recognizing their own situations in the descriptions of Weber's operation. Some had been trapped in the network for years, working multiple jobs, making endless payments, believing they had no alternative because the threats and manufactured evidence had convinced them that seeking help would result in worse consequences than continuing their exploitation. Each new victim statement added details to investigators' understanding of the network's operations and provided additional evidence for the cases being built against everyone involved. Prosecutors in multiple states coordinated charges, recognizing that the scale of the criminal enterprise required a comprehensive approach that addressed not just individual cases, but the entire organizational structure. Thomas Weber eventually accepted that silence wouldn't protect him from the evidence seized during the raid on his headquarters. His attorney negotiated an agreement, reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation in identifying the coordinator and providing testimony about the network's operations. Weber understood that his best chance of avoiding life imprisonment lay in helping authorities dismantle the organization that had employed him. His first substantial statement to investigators provided the breakthrough the case needed. Weber revealed that he had met the coordinator in person twice, both times at a restaurant in Seattle's International District. The meetings had been brief, focused on operational planning and profit distribution, but Weber had retained enough details to provide useful leads. More importantly, Weber provided access codes to encrypted communication channels used by the network's leadership. These channels, monitored now by federal agents, offered real-time intelligence about the organization's response to the Portland raid and its attempts to protect other operations from similar law enforcement attention. The messages revealed panic and recrimination within the network's leadership. The coordinator had ordered the immediate suspension of recruitment activities, instructed regional managers to destroy potentially incriminating records, and begun planning the shutdown of operations in territories where law enforcement attention seemed likely. The organization was adapting, trying to survive by sacrificing its most vulnerable elements while protecting its core structure and leadership. But the coordinator's efforts to limit damage had come too late. Federal investigators, armed with information from cooperating witnesses and evidence seized in Portland, moved simultaneously against network operations in 5 states. Raids conducted on the same day in California, Washington, Nevada, Oregon, and Arizona resulted in 43 arrests, the seizure of extensive records, and the rescue of more than 200 victims actively trapped in labor exploitation. The coordinated law enforcement action represented one of the largest operations ever conducted against a domestic trafficking and exploitation network. The evidence collected would support prosecutions spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving charges ranging from fraud and labor violations to racketeering and organized crime. Yet the coordinator remained unidentified, having gone silent in the communication channels monitored by federal agents. Somewhere, the architect of this vast exploitation network had disappeared, possibly fleeing the country, possibly preparing to rebuild operations in new territories, possibly watching news reports and planning countermeasures against the investigation that had dismantled the organization's infrastructure. The investigation's next phase would focus on identifying and apprehending this individual, following financial trails, tracking communication patterns, and pursuing every lead that might reveal who had built this network and where they had gone. The scale of the operation, the sophistication of its methods, and the scope of its victims demanded nothing less than complete dismantling of both the organization and the systems that had allowed it to flourish. As investigators worked around the clock to process evidence and coordinate prosecutions, Catherine Reynolds sat with Emma Carter in a victim advocacy office, helping the girl begin to process what she had endured and explaining that the nightmare she had survived was finally, truly over. The coordinator might have escaped for now, but the network that had trapped Emma and her father had been destroyed, and the people responsible for building and operating it would face justice. The case had revealed something profound and disturbing about modern America, that desperation could be transformed into profit, that systems designed to help people could be weaponized to exploit them, and that thousands of families could be trapped in modern servitude while the machinery of ordinary life continued around them, unaware and undisturbed. But the case had also revealed something else, that investigation, documentation, and determined effort could expose even the most sophisticated criminal operations, that victims could find the courage to come forward and help others escape the traps they had survived, and that justice, though sometimes slow and incomplete, remained possible. The hunt for the coordinator would continue, but for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized, the victims had begun their journey toward recovery, and a network that had operated in shadows had been dragged into light where its crimes could no longer hide. Seattle, Washington, May 15, 2019. 6 weeks after the coordinated raids that dismantled Thomas Weber's network across 5 states, FBI Special Agent Rachel Morrison stood in a conference room surrounded by evidence that would finally reveal the identity of the person who had built an empire on human desperation. The investigation had consumed every waking hour since the Portland breakthrough, following financial trails through labyrinthine corporate structures and tracking digital footprints across encrypted communication networks. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. A forensic accountant working through the seized financial records had noticed a pattern in expense reports filed by various regional managers over the past 3 years. Each manager had periodically submitted reimbursement requests for meals at high-end restaurants in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco, always billing these as business development expenses. Cross-referencing the dates and locations revealed that these meals coincided with periods when major operational decisions had been made or when problems in the network required resolution. The restaurants themselves provided crucial evidence. Security footage from establishments frequented by the network's managers showed the same individual meeting with different regional operators over an 18-month period. The person appeared in 15 separate recordings, always dressed professionally, always meeting one-on-one with managers, always maintaining careful awareness of surroundings in ways that suggested training in counter-surveillance techniques. Facial recognition analysis identified the individual as Richard Thornton, age 51, a former corporate consultant with a background in human resources management and business optimization. His legitimate career had included positions with several major corporations, work that gave him comprehensive understanding of employment systems, labor markets, and financial structures. That knowledge had apparently been redirected toward criminal purposes when legitimate opportunities failed to provide the income or lifestyle he desired. Thornton's background revealed a trajectory that investigators recognized from other cases involving white-collar criminals who transitioned into organized crime. Born into a middle-class family in suburban Seattle, he had earned degrees in business administration and organizational psychology from respected universities. His early career showed steady advancement through corporate ranks, with positions at companies known for aggressive cost-cutting and efficiency optimization. But financial records showed that Thornton had faced personal bankruptcy in his late 30s, following a series of failed investments and business ventures. The bankruptcy had damaged his professional reputation, making it difficult to secure positions at the level he'd previously enjoyed. Traditional employment no longer provided the income he needed to maintain the lifestyle he'd built during his corporate success years. The transition from legitimate business consultant to criminal network architect appeared to have occurred gradually. Thornton had initially worked as an independent consultant, helping small businesses optimize their operations and reduce labor costs. During this period, he'd apparently identified opportunities in the underground economy, recognizing that businesses desperate to reduce expenses would accept workers provided through questionable channels if those workers proved reliable and affordable. The sophistication of the network Thornton built reflected his corporate training. He had applied principles learned in legitimate business contexts to create an organization that functioned with ruthless efficiency. The franchise model that allowed regional managers like Thomas Weber to operate semi-independently while following standardized procedures came directly from corporate structures Thornton had studied and implemented during his legitimate career. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting that Thornton viewed the network as simply another business optimization problem. Communications recovered from encrypted servers showed him discussing victim management techniques and profit margins with the same detached professionalism he might have used analyzing spreadsheets in a corporate boardroom. The human cost of his operations appeared not to register as morally significant, only as variables to be managed for maximum financial return. Federal agents had been tracking Thornton's movements since his identity was confirmed 2 weeks earlier. He maintained a residence in an upscale Seattle neighborhood, drove expensive vehicles, and presented himself as a successful business consultant. His legitimate consulting work provided cover for his criminal activities, allowing him to maintain appearances while actually deriving most of his income from the exploitation network. Surveillance revealed that Thornton continued operating despite the raids that had dismantled much of his organization. He had immediately begun rebuilding, reaching out to contacts in territories that hadn't yet been compromised, attempting to establish new regional operations that could replace the income lost when Weber and other managers were arrested. The network's infrastructure had been damaged but not destroyed, and Thornton clearly believed he could adapt and survive the law enforcement pressure. His confidence proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Federal agents had allowed him to operate under surveillance, monitoring his communications and documenting his attempts to rebuild the network. Each contact he made, each meeting he conducted, each instruction he sent through encrypted channels provided additional evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise. The prosecution's case grew stronger with every day that Thornton remained free, unaware that his every move was being documented. The decision to arrest Thornton came after intercepted communications revealed plans to expand operations into new states and recruit additional regional managers. Federal prosecutors determined they had sufficient evidence to charge him with racketeering, conspiracy, human trafficking, and numerous other federal offenses that carried potential sentences totaling several lifetimes in prison. The arrest occurred on the morning of May 15th at Thornton's residence. Agents executed the warrant at 6 o'clock, when surveillance suggested he would be home alone. The operation proceeded without incident. Thornton offered no resistance, maintaining the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to controlling situations even when circumstances turned against him. The search of Thornton's home and office revealed additional evidence that would prove crucial for prosecution. Unlike Thomas Weber, who had maintained detailed records at his operational headquarters, Thornton had kept most incriminating documentation in personal storage encrypted on devices seized during the arrest. Forensic examination of these devices would take months, but initial analysis showed communications with dozens of individuals involved in the network's operations, financial records documenting millions in criminal proceeds, and strategic planning documents that revealed the full scope of Thornton's ambitions. Most chilling were files containing research into potential future expansion opportunities. Thornton had been studying bankruptcy patterns, medical debt statistics, and economic vulnerability indicators in cities across the United States, identifying new markets where his exploitation model might prove profitable. The documents suggested he had been planning expansion into the Midwest and Southeast, regions where medical debt rates were high and regulatory oversight of labor practices was comparatively weak. The arrest made national news, with media coverage focusing on the scale of the network and the number of victims exploited over its operational lifetime. Reporters interviewed former victims who described their experiences, explaining how they had been trapped by manufactured threats and desperate circumstances. The stories humanized what might otherwise have remained abstract statistics, showing the real families whose lives had been devastated by Thornton's criminal enterprise. Public reaction mixed outrage at the exploitation with troubling questions about the systems that had made such a network possible. How had hundreds of families been trapped in modern servitude without anyone noticing? Why had medical debt created vulnerabilities that criminals could exploit so effectively? What failures in social safety nets and regulatory oversight had allowed this to continue for years? These questions prompted legislative responses at both state and federal levels. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at strengthening protections for people facing medical debt, improving oversight of debt collection practices, and creating better mechanisms for identifying and investigating labor exploitation. The case provided momentum for reforms that advocates had been seeking for years, translating public outrage into potential policy changes. Meanwhile, prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions coordinated the complex process of building cases against everyone involved in the network's operations. Thomas Weber and other regional managers who had agreed to cooperate provided detailed testimony about the organization's structure and methods. Their statements, combined with documentary evidence seized during raids, created a comprehensive picture of how the network had functioned at every level. The corruption uncovered during the investigation extended beyond the network's core operators. 3 hospital administrators who had inflated patient bills and referred vulnerable people to Thornton's front organizations faced charges of fraud and conspiracy. Business owners who had knowingly employed workers provided through the network faced labor law violations. Individuals who had forged documents or provided other support services faced charges appropriate to their specific roles. The scope of the prosecution effort was unprecedented. More than 60 individuals faced federal or state charges related to the network's operations. The trials would span years, requiring massive coordination between prosecutors, investigators, and victim advocates. But the commitment to holding everyone accountable remained absolute. The scale of the exploitation demanded nothing less than comprehensive justice for the thousands of victims whose lives had been stolen. For Emma Carter and her father David, the resolution of the case brought a mixture of relief and complex emotions. The man who had orchestrated the system that trapped them would face accountability, but the trauma they had endured couldn't be erased by any legal outcome. Catherine Reynolds continued working with the family, connecting them with resources for medical care, counseling, and financial recovery. David's fraudulent debt had been legally resolved, with courts dismissing the manufactured charges and vacating the medical bills that had been illegally inflated. He received compensation through a victim services fund established using assets seized from Thornton and other network operators. The money couldn't replace the time stolen from his daughter's childhood or repair the physical damage from months of inadequate medical care, but it provided stability that allowed the family to begin rebuilding. Emma returned to school in the fall, enrolled in 8th grade with support services to help her catch up academically and process the trauma she had experienced. Teachers and counselors reported that she showed remarkable resilience, though the maturity forced upon her by circumstances remained evident. She no longer possessed the carefree innocence typical of children her age, but she demonstrated determination to reclaim the future that had almost been stolen from her. The broader investigation revealed that Thornton's network had exploited more than 800 families over its operational lifetime, generating an estimated $18 million in criminal proceeds. The true scope might never be fully known, as many victims remained too ashamed or frightened to come forward even after the network's destruction. Victim advocates worked tirelessly to reach people who might have been exploited, using media coverage to spread awareness that the threats they feared were no longer operative and that help was available. Slowly, additional victims emerged, each one adding to the documented human cost of Thornton's criminal enterprise and strengthening the case for maximum penalties in his eventual trial. The financial investigation traced assets through complex networks of shell companies and offshore accounts. Forensic accountants identified properties, investments, and accounts containing proceeds from the exploitation network. Federal law allowed seizure of these assets, which would eventually be used to compensate victims and fund services for people recovering from trafficking and exploitation. Thornton's legitimate business suffered immediate collapse following his arrest. Corporate clients terminated contracts, professional associations revoked his memberships, and his reputation transformed from successful consultant to notorious criminal. The life he had built through exploitation crumbled as thoroughly as the lives of the families he had destroyed. As summer approached, federal prosecutors prepared for trial, organizing the massive evidence collection into a coherent narrative that would demonstrate Thornton's central role in building and operating the network. They anticipated a lengthy court battle, as Thornton's attorneys would certainly challenge every aspect of the charges and evidence. But prosecutors felt confident that the documentation was comprehensive, and the witness testimony would prove compelling. The case had evolved far beyond its origins as a truancy investigation in Northeast Portland. What Catherine Reynolds had discovered when checking on one absent student had exposed a criminal enterprise that embodied some of the darkest aspects of modern American society: the transformation of desperation into profit, the systematic exploitation of families made vulnerable by medical debt, and the sophisticated adaptation of criminal methods to exploit weaknesses in systems designed to protect people. But the case had also demonstrated the possibility of justice and accountability. Determined investigation had exposed crimes that had hidden in plain sight. Victims had found courage to come forward and help others escape the traps they had survived. Prosecutors had coordinated across jurisdictions to hold criminals accountable. And society had been forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the systems that had made such exploitation possible. Richard Thornton sat in federal detention awaiting trial, his carefully constructed criminal empire dismantled, his assets seized, his future measured in decades of imprisonment rather than the retirement of luxury he had planned to fund through others' suffering. The architect of a network that had stolen years from hundreds of families would now face the full weight of justice for his crimes. The investigation had revealed one final truth that would resonate beyond this specific case: that modern exploitation often wore the mask of legitimate business, that predators could be educated professionals rather than obvious criminals, and that protecting vulnerable people required constant vigilance against those who would transform desperation into profit through sophisticated systems of control. As investigators closed their files on the case's active phase and prepared for the trials that would extend into the following year, they understood that similar networks might exist elsewhere, that other criminals might be studying Thornton's methods and adapting them to avoid the mistakes that led to his exposure. The work of protecting vulnerable people was never finished, only temporarily successful. But for now, more than 800 families had been freed from exploitation. 60-plus criminals faced accountability, and one 12-year-old girl who had survived impossible circumstances could begin to imagine a future defined by possibility rather than desperation. In the end, perhaps that was the most important measure of justice: not just punishing the guilty, but restoring hope to those who had been robbed of it by criminals who mistook human beings for resources to be extracted and discarded. The case of Emma Carter and the network that trapped her family would be studied for years in law enforcement training programs, victim advocacy workshops, and policy discussions about medical debt and labor exploitation. It stood as both a warning about what could happen when vulnerable people fell through society's safety nets and proof that exposure, accountability, and justice remained possible even against sophisticated criminal enterprises designed to operate invisibly. The hunt that began with one girl's unexplained absence had ended with the arrest of the man who had built an empire on stolen lives. What remained was the long work of trials, convictions, and recovery, the necessary process of transforming investigation into justice and survival into healing. Portland, Oregon, November 12, 2019. 8 months after Emma Carter's truancy triggered an investigation that would expose one of the largest labor exploitation networks in recent American history. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland prepared for the conclusion of the case that had captured national attention. Richard Thornton's trial had consumed 6 weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal arguments that documented in excruciating detail how he had built a criminal empire on the suffering of hundreds of families. The prosecution had presented a case that combined documentary evidence, financial records, communications intercepts, and testimony from victims and cooperating witnesses. More than 40 former victims had taken the stand to describe their experiences, explaining how manufactured threats and desperate circumstances had trapped them in cycles of exploitation that seemed impossible to escape. Emma Carter had not been required to testify, prosecutors determining that her age and the trauma she had endured made such an appearance unnecessary given the abundance of other evidence. But her story had been told through Catherine Reynolds' testimony, through the records seized from Thomas Weber's headquarters, and through the impact statements submitted by her and her father for consideration during sentencing. The defense had attempted to portray Thornton as a businessman who had provided opportunities to people desperate for work, arguing that his clients had entered arrangements voluntarily and could have left at any time. But this argument collapsed under the weight of evidence showing systematic coercion, manufactured threats, and the sophisticated psychological manipulation that had kept victims trapped even when no physical barriers prevented their escape. Expert witnesses explained the mechanisms of modern exploitation, describing how criminals had adapted traditional trafficking methods to create systems of voluntary servitude. Rather than kidnapping or physically restraining victims, operations like Thornton's used debt, fear, and manufactured evidence to create prisons that existed primarily in victims' minds but proved just as effective at maintaining control. The jury had deliberated for 4 days before returning with verdicts that satisfied prosecutors and advocates who had worked tirelessly on the case. Richard Thornton was found guilty on all 37 counts charged against him: racketeering, conspiracy, human trafficking, fraud, money laundering, and numerous other federal offenses. Each conviction carried significant prison time, and taken together, they ensured Thornton would spend the remainder of his life in federal custody. The sentencing hearing drew more than 100 people to the courthouse, including victims, advocates, investigators, and media representatives, documenting the conclusion of a case that had revealed uncomfortable truths about American society. Judge Patricia Morrison, who had presided over the trial with patience and firm control, reviewed the evidence and legal arguments before delivering a sentence that reflected both the severity of Thornton's crimes and the devastating impact on his victims. The judge sentenced Thornton to 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, the maximum allowed under federal guidelines for the crimes proven at trial. Additional sentences for other convictions would run consecutively, ensuring that even if appeals succeeded on some charges, Thornton would remain incarcerated for decades. At age 51, the sentence essentially guaranteed he would die in prison, never again free to harm others. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Morrison delivered remarks that captured the moral dimensions of the case beyond its legal technicalities. She spoke about the betrayal of trust inherent in Thornton's crimes, how he had taken systems meant to help desperate people and transformed them into tools of exploitation. She described the lasting damage inflicted on victims, particularly children like Emma Carter, who had been forced into adult responsibilities and robbed of childhood experiences they could never reclaim. The judge also addressed broader societal issues highlighted by the case. She noted that while Thornton bore individual responsibility for his actions, the system he exploited revealed failures in healthcare access, debt collection practices, and labor protections that made vulnerable people susceptible to such exploitation. Her remarks included calls for legislative action to address these systemic vulnerabilities, transforming the case from an isolated criminal matter into a catalyst for potential reform. Thomas Weber and other regional managers who had cooperated with investigators received reduced sentences reflecting their assistance. Weber was sentenced to 15 years with possibility of parole after serving 85% of his term. While substantial, the sentence acknowledged his role in exposing the network's full scope and providing crucial testimony against Thornton. Other cooperating defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, depending on their levels of involvement and cooperation. Those who refused to cooperate faced the full weight of federal sentencing guidelines. Christopher Hayes, who had managed employment placements and refused to testify against Thornton, received 22 years. Jennifer Martinez, who created fraudulent evidence used to control victims, received 18 years. The message was clear. Cooperation might earn leniency, but those who chose loyalty to the criminal enterprise over accountability to victims would face severe consequences. The 3 hospital administrators who had inflated bills and referred vulnerable patients to Thornton's network faced state charges in addition to federal prosecution. Their trials resulted in convictions and sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years, plus permanent revocation of their medical administration licenses. The medical community's professional organizations issued statements condemning the betrayal of trust and implementing new oversight procedures designed to prevent similar corruption. Business owners who had knowingly employed workers provided through the network faced a mixture of criminal charges and civil penalties. Some received prison sentences for labor law violations, while others accepted plea agreements requiring payment of restitution, fines, and permanent prohibition from certain business activities. The prosecutions sent a clear message that participating in exploitation networks carried serious consequences, even for those who weren't primary organizers. The comprehensive prosecution effort resulted in convictions against 54 individuals associated with the network's operations. Additional cases remained pending against suspects who had fled or were contesting charges. The total impact on the criminal enterprise was devastating. Its leadership imprisoned, its infrastructure dismantled, its financial resources seized, and its operational methods exposed in ways that would make replication significantly more difficult. For victims, the convictions provided a measure of closure and validation. The justice system had acknowledged their suffering, held the perpetrators accountable, and provided compensation through seized assets. But the healing process extended far beyond legal outcomes. Many victims required years of counseling to process trauma and rebuild their lives after exploitation that had stolen time, dignity, and sense of security. Emma Carter's recovery exemplified both the possibility of healing and the lasting impact of trauma. Now 13 and in 8th grade, she had made remarkable academic progress with help from tutors and specialized support services. Her grades placed her back among the top students in her class, suggesting that the intelligence and determination that had helped her survive 6 months of exploitation could be redirected toward building the future she deserved. But the experience had changed her in ways that couldn't be remedied by academic success or legal accountability. Teachers described her as mature beyond her years, sometimes displaying anxiety when faced with situations that reminded her of her time trapped in the network. She participated in counseling sessions twice weekly, working to process experiences that no child should have endured, and learning to separate the survival skills she had developed from the healthy emotional development appropriate to her age. David Carter had also made significant progress toward recovery. Medical treatment funded by victim compensation had addressed injuries that had never properly healed after his original accident. While he retained some physical limitations, he had been able to return to work in a modified capacity, providing stability for his family and restoring his sense of dignity and purpose. He too participated in counseling, addressing the guilt he felt over circumstances that had made his daughter vulnerable to exploitation. The Carter family had moved to a new apartment in a better neighborhood, funded by compensation from seized assets and supplemented by community support that emerged after their story became public. Local organizations had provided furniture, school supplies, and other necessities, demonstrating the capacity for compassion that existed alongside the systems that had failed to protect them originally. Catherine Reynolds continued her work with Child Protective Services, now with an enhanced understanding of how exploitation networks operated and what signs might indicate children trapped in similar circumstances. She had become an advocate for policy changes that would strengthen protections for vulnerable families, testifying before legislative committees and training other investigators in recognition techniques developed through the Carter case. Detective Brian Foster had been promoted following the successful investigation, taking a leadership role in a newly created task force focused on identifying and dismantling labor exploitation networks. His expertise, hard-won through the case that began with Emma Carter's truancy, would now be applied to protecting others who might be targeted by criminals adapting Thornton's methods or developing new approaches to the same underlying exploitation model. FBI Special Agent Rachel Morrison had received commendations for her role in coordinating the multi-state investigation that dismantled Thornton's network. She continued working cases involving human trafficking and exploitation, bringing the knowledge gained from this investigation to bear on new cases that revealed the ongoing nature of such crimes. Her team had identified patterns suggesting other networks might be operating in regions beyond the original investigation scope, requiring continued vigilance and proactive investigation. The case prompted significant legislative responses at both federal and state levels. Congress passed the Medical Debt Protection Act, creating new safeguards against aggressive collection practices and establishing oversight mechanisms to prevent the inflation of medical bills. The law also provided funding for programs helping people negotiate medical debt and access resources before desperation made them vulnerable to exploitation. Multiple states, including Oregon, enacted labor protection laws that strengthened penalties for employing underage workers and created better reporting mechanisms for identifying potential exploitation situations. Schools implemented new protocols for responding to truancy and signs of distress in students, recognizing that unexplained absences or changes in behavior might indicate serious problems requiring immediate intervention. Professional organizations representing healthcare administrators, debt collectors, and employment agencies established new ethical guidelines and oversight procedures designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had enabled Thornton's network. While critics argued these measures were reactive rather than preventive, they represented acknowledgement that systemic failures had contributed to the exploitation and that multiple sectors bore responsibility for protecting vulnerable people. Victim advocacy organizations used the case to raise awareness about modern exploitation and the signs that might indicate someone was trapped in a similar situation. Public education campaigns emphasized that trafficking and exploitation didn't always look like dramatic kidnapping scenarios, but often involved psychological control, manufactured debt, and systematic isolation that trapped people in circumstances they felt powerless to escape. Research institutions studying human trafficking and labor exploitation analyzed the case extensively, publishing papers and reports that documented the network's methods and identifying lessons for prevention and intervention. The case became a primary example in law enforcement training programs, victim advocate education, and policy discussions about protecting vulnerable populations from sophisticated criminal operations. As 2019 drew to a close, the anniversary of Emma Carter's return to school approached. 1 year had passed since Catherine Reynolds received the call about a truant student. 1 year since an investigation began that would expose a criminal empire and free hundreds of families from exploitation. The anniversary provided an opportunity for reflection on what had been learned and what work remained. Emma herself marked the anniversary quietly, surrounded by family and the support network that had formed around her recovery. She had begun speaking to victim advocacy groups about her experience, carefully and with therapeutic support, helping others understand that seeking help was possible, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Her courage in sharing her story inspired other victims to come forward, expanding the support community and ensuring that fewer people suffered in silence. The case of Emma Carter and the network that trapped her family would endure as a landmark example of both human cruelty and resilience. It demonstrated how sophisticated criminals could exploit systemic vulnerabilities to build empires on suffering, but also showed that investigation, accountability, and justice remained possible when dedicated individuals refused to accept that such exploitation was inevitable or invisible. 12-year-old Emma Carter had survived circumstances that would have broken many adults. Her strength, determination, and ultimate courage to accept help had not only freed her and her father, but had exposed a network that threatened hundreds of other families. The investigation triggered by her truancy had revealed truths about modern exploitation that society couldn't ignore, prompting reforms that would protect others from similar fates. As the courthouse emptied after Thornton's sentencing and victims began the long journey of rebuilding lives stolen by criminal exploitation, one truth emerged clearly: that hard work took many forms, that true strength appeared in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important discoveries came from paying attention to small signs that something was wrong in the life of a child who should have been worrying about homework and friends rather than survival and sacrifice. The case was closed, the criminals convicted, the network dismantled. But the lessons learned and the reforms triggered would continue protecting vulnerable people long after the specific details faded from public attention. In the end, that legacy, born from one girl's terrible ordeal, and the investigation that followed, might prove to be the most important outcome of all. Emma Carter could finally be what she always should have been, a 13-year-old girl with hopes, dreams, and the security of knowing that the nightmare was over and the future was hers to build. The hard work she had endured hadn't broken her. Instead, it had revealed a strength that would serve her well as she moved forward into a life defined not by exploitation and fear, but by possibility, support, and justice finally served.